Before we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the cultures behind the stories we are about to explore. The tales shared here come from many peoples, lands, and traditions. I do not change these stories to fit modern expectations or to align with today's social standards. Instead, I present them as they were told, sometimes beautiful, sometimes harsh, sometimes challenging. We are not here to judge the past, but to understand it, to listen, to learn, and to honor the ancestors who carried these stories forward. We also share stories from various religious traditions. These are presented in their historical and spiritual context, with respect for their beliefs that they represent. Every culture deserves respect, context, and acknowledgement, and this space is dedicated to doing exactly that. Story 1. Hermes and the Cattle of Apollo. In the cave upon Mount Cyllene, the nymph Maia gave birth to Hermes, son of Zeus. And before the first day of his life had ended, the newborn god had already begun the deeds that would make him famous among the immortals. He slipped from his cradle and wandered beyond the cave, where he found a tortoise and carried it inside, fashioning its shell into the first lyre by stretching strings across it and drawing from the instrument a music no one had heard before. Yet music alone did not satisfy him, and as evening came, Hermes traveled north to Perea, where the sacred cattle of his elder brother Apollo grazed beneath the open sky. From the herd, he drove away 50 cattle, but knowing that Apollo would search for their tracks, Hermes turned the animals backwards so that their hoofprints appeared to lead toward the pasture they had left. He disguised his own footprints with strange sandals woven from the branches and drove the cattle across the land until he reached the river Alpheus, where he concealed them in a shelter. There he kindled the fire and slaughtered 2 of the animals, dividing the meat into 12 portions for the gods, though he himself did not eat. When the traces of the fire had been hidden and the remaining cattle secured, Hermes returned to Mount Cyllene, slipped into the cave, and wrapped himself once more into his blankets with the lyre beside him. Maia knew that her infant son had not spent the night quietly in his cradle, but Hermes answered her warnings with confidence, for he had no intention of remaining hidden in a lonely cave while the other children of Zeus received honors among the gods. Apollo soon discovered that part of his herd was missing and followed the bewildering trail until he reached Maia's cave, where he found Hermes lying like a helpless newborn. When accused of the theft, Hermes denied everything. He claimed that he had been born only the day before, that his feet were too tender for such a journey, and that he knew nothing of cattle beyond the accusation Apollo had brought against him. Apollo did not believe him and carried the infant before Zeus, where Hermes continued its defense and swore that he had not stolen the herd. Zeus, seeing through the lies of the newborn son, laughed and commanded the brothers to recover the cattle and settle the matter between them. Hermes led Apollo to the hidden herd, but when he took up the lyre and began to play, Apollo's anger gave way to wonder. The god of prophecy had never heard such an instrument, and he desired it so greatly that Hermes offered it to him in exchange for the cattle. Apollo accepted, and what had begun as a theft became an exchange between the brothers. Hermes later fashioned another instrument, the reed pipe, and received further gifts and honors from Apollo, while Zeus gave him a place among the immortals as a herald and messenger. The newborn, who had reversed tracks, crossed the countryside, deceived his elder brother, and transformed a tortoiseshell into music, became the god who moved wherever boundaries opened, along roads and through marketplaces, between strangers and traders, from Olympus to the mortal world, and even among the paths traveled by the dead. Hermes had entered the world without a kingdom of his own, but before his earliest days were finished, he had found his place among the gods by doing what he would always do best, crossing the distance between one thing and another and changing what passed through his hands. Story 2. Thoth and the 5 extra days. In the earliest age of the world, the sky goddess Nu and the earth god Jeb loved one another so closely that the sky lay upon the earth. And from their union, children were destined to be born. But Ra, the great sun god, learned that one of those children would someday rule in his place, and in anger he declared that Nu would give birth on no day of the year. At that time, the year contained only 360 days, and because every one of them belonged to the year, Nu found herself trapped by the decree. She carried her children, but had no day upon which they could enter the world. Then Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, calculation, and divine knowledge, came to her aid. Thoth did not challenge Ra by force, nor did he attempt to break the decree directly. Instead, he turned to Khonsu, the moon god, whose light was then said to shine more brightly than it would in later ages, and invited him to a game. The two gods played at Senet, or in some later tellings, at Diche, and they wagered portions of the moon's light upon the outcome. Again and again Thoth won, gathering enough of Khonsu's radiance to create 5 complete days. These days had not belonged to the original 360 days of the year, and therefore did not fall beneath the prohibition Ra had spoken. Thoth placed them outside the old year, and upon the first of these new days, Nut gave birth to Osiris. Upon the second, she bore Horus the Elder, a form of the ancient sky god distinct in his tradition from the later child of Isis and Osiris. Upon the third day came Set, who was said to have entered the world violently. Upon the fourth day Isis was born, and upon the fifth came Nephthys. Thus the children whom Ra had forbidden Nut to bear entered the world without the decree ever being broken, because Thoth had found a space between the boundaries of the existing year. The 5 additional days became the epigonal days, standing apart from the 12 months of the 30 days each, and bringing the Egyptian civil calendar to 365 days. The victory also explained why the moon no longer shone with the fullness it had once possessed, for the light Thoth had won from Khonsu had been given another form and placed into time itself. From those 5 days came gods whose births would shape some of the greatest stories of ancient Egypt. The kingship and death of Osiris, the devotion and magic of Isis, the violence of Set, and the long struggles over the divine throne. Yet before any of these stories could begin, there had first been a problem that seemed impossible. A goddess carried children she could not bear. A decree had closed every day against her. Thoth found the answer not by destroying the law, but by discovering what the law had failed to name. And from the light of the moon, he made room in the calendar for 5 new days and 5 divine births. Story 3, the Chasqui and the Roads of the Inca. Across the mountains and valleys of the Tawantinsuyu, the vast realm known today as the Inca Empire, roads stretched farther than any one messenger could run. They climbed high into the Andes, crossed cold mountain passes, descended toward coastal deserts, passed through fertile valleys, and connected distant communities with Cusco, the imperial center. Along these roads moved the Chasquis, trained runners who carried messengers through a relay system built upon speed, memory, and the certainty that another runner would be waiting ahead. A Chasqui did not take a message from one end of the empire to the other. Instead, runners waited at small stations called Chasquiwasi, houses placed at intervals along the road. When one messenger approached, he announced his arrival with a shell trumpet known as a pututu, warning the next runner to prepare. The waiting Chasqui ran out to meet him, and for a short distance the two moved together while the first delivered whatever had been entrusted to him. Sometimes the message was spoken and had to be remembered precisely. Sometimes the runner carried a quipu, a record made from cords and knots whose colors, positions, and patterns could preserve numerical information and other forms of meaning. The new runner took the message and continued forward while the first returned to the station to rest and wait for another call. In this way, a message moved without stopping, even when the person carrying it had changed again and again. The roads themselves belonged to the Capac Neon, the great Andean road system that joined regions spread across thousands of miles. Stone paths climbed slopes where wheels would have been useless. Stairways cut through steep terrain and rope suspension. Bridges crossed deep gorges above rushing rivers. The Chasquis had to know these roads, endure thin mountain air, carried the messages so quickly across landscapes that could change from freezing heights to dry valleys within a single journey. They carried orders from rulers and officials, news from distant provinces, military information and records needed to govern a realm whose people spoke different languages and lived across enormous distances. Some accounts also describe runners carrying fresh foods and other prized goods in relays toward the imperial center, allowing items from distant regions to travel with astonishing speed. Yet the greatest burden of the Chasqui was often invisible. A spoken message could not be dropped, reread, or corrected once the first runner had passed it onward. Each messenger had to receive the words, hold them, and give them to the next person without allowing the meaning to change along the road. The message therefore belonged not to one runner, but to the entire chain. One Chasqui climbed until another took the words from him. One crossed a bridge and placed the message into the memory of the next. One sounded the pututu, and somewhere ahead another runner rose to his feet. Across the Tawantinsuyu, the system continued day and night, carrying information through a realm where mountains divided communities, but roads joined them. No single Chasqui crossed the whole empire, and no single pair of legs needed to. The message traveled because, at every station, someone was waiting to receive what another person had carried as far as he could. Story 4, Ame-no-Uzume, and the Return of the Sun. When Susanoo, the stormy younger brother of the sun goddess Amaterasu, brought destruction into the heavenly realm of Takamagahara, trampling fields, breaking sacred boundaries, and hurling a flaying horse into the hall where the heavenly weaving maidens worked, Amaterasu withdrew from the world. She entered the rock cave called Ame-no-Uzume and rolled the great stone door closed behind her, hiding her light within the earth. With the sun goddess gone, darkness covered both the plain of high heaven and the world below. Crops failed, disorder spread, and countless troublesome spirits rose in the absence of daylight. The gods gathered beside the Amayo Yasu Kewa, the heavenly river, and sought the counsel of Oimoikane, the deity of wisdom and thought. Following his plan, they gathered roosters whose cries announced the dawn, uprooted a sacred sakeki tree, and hung from its branches curved jewels and polished mirrors made by the divine smiths. Offerings were prepared, prayers were spoken, and the gods assembled outside the sealed cave, but Amaterasu remained within the darkness. Then Ame-no-Uzume overturned a tub near the entrance and climbed upon it. She stamped her feet until the hollow vessel thundered beneath her, entered a wild and ecstatic dance, and exposed herself before the gathered gods. The assembly erupted in laughter so great that the sound shook the heavens. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard them and became curious. She could not understand how the gods could be celebrating while the world remained without her light, and from behind the stone she asked why they laughed. Uzume answered that they had found a deity greater and more radiant than Amaterasu herself. The sun goddess opened the cave just enough to look outside, and the gods raised a sacred mirror before her. Amaterasu saw the brilliant figure reflected within it and, not recognizing her own image, leaned farther from the darkness to see the mysterious deity. At that moment, the powerful god, Ame-no-Tajikao, seized her hand and pulled her from the cave, while Futodama stretched a sacred rope called Shimenawa across the entrance so that she could not retreat again. Light returned to heaven and earth. The gods rejoiced, the darkness lifted, and Susanoo was punished and driven from the heavenly realm for the destruction that had caused Amaterasu to hide. Uzume's part in the story did not end beside the cave. When Amaterasu later sent her descendant, Ninigi, from heaven toward the earthly world, a strange radiant deity stood at the crossroads between heaven and earth, shining so brightly that none of the other gods dared approach. Once again, Uzume stepped forward. She confronted the stranger and demanded to know his name and purpose. He revealed himself as Saruta Hiko, an earthly deity who had come to guide Ninigi safely on his descent. Uzume carried his words back to Amaterasu and then accompanied the heavenly party toward the world below. Thus, the goddess who had once drawn the sun from the cave also became the one willing to approach the unknown figure standing between realms, hear what he had come to say, and carry the answer back. At the cave, she reached Amaterasu through laughter when commands had failed. At the crossroads, she reached a stranger when the other gods would not approach. And in both stories, the distance between one world and another closed only after Ame-no-Uzume stepped into the space between them. Daily Thread for July 12th. Across the roads of Greece, beneath the measured heavens of Egypt, over the mountains of the Andes, and outside a sealed cave in the Japanese heavens, today's stories remind us that a message is never only the words being carried. Hermes crossed boundaries that separated gods, mortals, strangers, traders, and the dead, transforming whatever passed through his hands until stolen cattle became exchanged. Conflict became alliance, and a newborn hidden in a cave found his place among the immortals. Thoth faced a decree that had closed every existing day against Newt and carried an answer through the one place that law had not reached, creating 5 new days from the light of the moon so that the 5 divine children could enter the world. Across the vast Tawantinsuyu, the Chasqui carried spoken words, knotted records, orders, and news over roads too long for any single runner to finish, each person holding the message only long enough to place it safely into the hands and memory of the next. And when Amaterasu sealed herself inside the heavenly cave, Ame-no-Uzume discovered that no command could reach through the stone, so she sensed something else into the darkness, the thunder of her feet, the laughter of the gods, and the sound of a world still waiting outside. Though these messengers moved beneath different skies, each crossed a distance that could not remain empty. Between one god and another, between a decree and an impossible birth, between mountains and distant cities, between darkness and light, something had to pass. Perhaps this is why messages change so much depending upon how they are carried. The truth spoken with cruelty does not arrive as the same truth spoken with care. A story passed from one person to another gathers the breath of every voice that keeps it alive. A silence can carry what words refuse to say, and laughter can sometimes reach a place where pleading cannot enter. As tonight's fire settles into glowing embers, consider this. What message am I carrying? What have I been passing through my words, my works, my silence, my stories, and the way I move through the lives of others? Perhaps we are all messengers more often than we realize, receiving something from those who came before us, carrying it across the distance that belongs to us, and deciding what condition it will be in when we place it in the hands of whoever waits ahead.